The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of southeastern Italy as two massive armies prepared for what would become one of history's most decisive battles. The year was 216 BCE, and the Second Punic War had already raged for 2 brutal years, transforming the Western Mediterranean into a theatre of unprecedented destruction and ambition. On one side stood Rome, the rising power whose legions had conquered most of Italy through disciplined warfare and relentless expansion. On the other stood Carthage, the ancient maritime empire whose very existence now hung in the balance, represented by a polyglot army led by one of history's most brilliant military minds. The conflict had begun 2 years earlier when Hannibal Barca, the young Carthaginian general, had done the unthinkable. Rather than accept Rome's growing dominance or fight a conventional naval war in the Mediterranean, he had chosen to strike at the heart of Roman power by launching an audacious overland invasion of Italy itself. The journey had been legendary in its scope and suffering. Hannibal had marched his diverse army of Africans, Spaniards and Gauls through the treacherous passes of the Alps, losing nearly half his men to cold, starvation, and the fierce resistance of mountain tribes. Yet what remained was a hardened, veteran force that had already proven its mettle against Roman armies. The shock of Hannibal's appearance in northern Italy had reverberated through Rome like an earthquake. For centuries the Romans had fought their wars on foreign soil, pushing their boundaries ever outward while their homeland remained secure behind the natural barriers of sea and mountain. Now, suddenly enemy forces were ravaging the fertile plains of the Po Valley, and Roman citizens were fleeing their farms as Carthaginian cavalry thundered across fields their families had tilled for generations. The first encounters had gone disastrously for Rome. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, Hannibal had demonstrated his tactical genius by drawing a Roman army into a carefully prepared ambush. Using the bitter December cold and his superior knowledge of the terrain, he had positioned troops in hidden positions along the riverbank. When the Roman legions crossed the icy waters to engage what they believed was Hannibal's main force, they found themselves attacked from all sides by fresh troops who had been concealed through the night. The slaughter had been comprehensive, with thousands of Roman soldiers cut down in the freezing mud or drowned in the swollen river. The following year brought an even more stunning defeat at Lake Trasimene. Here, Hannibal had perfected the art of the ambush on a massive scale. He had positioned his army in the hills overlooking the narrow pass between the lake and the mountains, then waited for the pursuing Roman army to march into what was essentially a killing ground. As morning mist rose from the lake, obscuring visibility, the Carthaginians had fallen upon the Roman column from 3 sides simultaneously. The consul Gaius Flaminius had died in the fighting, and his army had been virtually annihilated. So complete was the destruction that it took days for news of the disaster to reach Rome, and when it did, panic gripped the city. In response to these catastrophes, Rome had turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus, a cautious general who understood that conventional tactics would only lead to further disasters against Hannibal's superior generalship. Fabius had adopted a strategy of harassment and attrition, avoiding pitched battles while constantly shadowing the Carthaginian army. His troops would strike at Hannibal's foragers, cut off stragglers, and deny the enemy army the decisive victory it sought, while protecting Roman towns and supply lines. This approach, which came to be known as Fabian tactics, had frustrated Hannibal's attempts to force a conclusive engagement, and had earned Fabius the mocking nickname Cunctator, the delayer. But the Roman Senate and people had grown impatient with this cautious approach. The sight of enemy troops ravaging Italian soil while Roman armies seemed to cower in the hills was more than Roman pride could bear. The economy was suffering as trade routes were disrupted and agricultural production declined in the war zones. Perhaps most importantly, Rome's network of Italian allies was beginning to waver as they questioned whether their powerful patron could truly protect them from this Carthaginian threat. The pressure for decisive action had reached a crescendo in the spring of 216 BCE, when 2 new consuls were elected to lead Rome's military response. Gaius Terentius Varro represented the popular party and the common people's demand for aggressive action against the invaders. He was a man of humble origins who had risen through Rome's cursus honorum through political skill and populist appeals rather than military distinction. His speeches in the Forum had electrified crowds with promises to end the war quickly through bold offensive action. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, by contrast, represented the aristocratic faction and favoured a more measured approach. He was a seasoned general who had commanded legions in previous campaigns and understood the complexities of warfare against a cunning enemy like Hannibal. The tension between these two men reflected the broader divisions within Roman society about how to respond to the Carthaginian threat. Varro accused the aristocrats of cowardice and self-interest, claiming they prolonged the war to maintain their commands and enrich themselves at the state's expense. Paulus and his supporters countered that rash action would only lead to more disasters like Trebia and Trasimene. However, the popular will for aggressive action proved overwhelming, and the Senate authorized the raising of the largest army in Roman history to that point. The mobilization that followed was unprecedented in scale and ambition. Rome called up not only its own citizens, but also demanded contingents from every allied city and tribe throughout Italy. Veterans were recalled from retirement. Young men barely old enough to bear arms were pressed into service, and even slaves were offered freedom in exchange for military service. The entire Roman war machine was focused on creating a force so massive that it could overwhelm Hannibal through sheer numbers, regardless of his tactical superiority. When the levies were complete, Rome had assembled an army of approximately 80 to 90,000 men, divided into 8 legions plus an equal number of allied troops. This represented nearly 10% of Rome's entire military-age male population, a commitment that demonstrated both the state's desperation and its confidence in numerical superiority. The logistics of supplying and moving such a massive force was staggering, requiring thousands of pack animals, hundreds of supply wagons, and a complex network of depots and supply lines stretching back to Rome itself. Meanwhile, Hannibal's army had been reduced by 2 years of continuous campaigning to perhaps 40 to 50,000 effective fighters. However, what these men lacked in numbers they more than compensated for in experience and diversity. The core of his infantry consisted of Libyan troops, veterans of campaigns in Spain and Africa, who fought with captured Roman equipment and had adopted many Roman tactical innovations while retaining their own traditions of individual combat skill. These were supplemented by Gallic warriors from tribes in both Spain and northern Italy, fierce fighters who brought their own weapons and fighting styles to the Carthaginian cause. Spanish infantry provided another crucial element, disciplined troops armed with their distinctive falcata swords and experienced in both individual and formation combat. But perhaps Hannibal's greatest advantage lay in his cavalry, which was both more numerous and far superior in quality to anything the Romans could field. Numidian light cavalry from North Africa were legendary throughout the Mediterranean for their skill as horse archers and their ability to harass enemy formations while remaining virtually uncatchable in open terrain. These riders, who fought without saddles or bridles and controlled their mounts through knee pressure alone, could appear suddenly from clouds of dust, rain javelins and arrows on enemy formations, and disappear again before retaliation was possible. Heavy cavalry from Spain and Gaul provided the shock troops necessary for decisive charges, while their superior numbers meant that Hannibal could use mounted forces not just for reconnaissance and harassment, but as a genuine tactical arm capable of deciding battles. The diversity of Hannibal's army was both a strength and a challenge. Managing troops who spoke different languages, fought with different weapons, and came from cultures with vastly different military traditions required exceptional leadership and organisational skill. Yet this diversity also provided tactical flexibility that no homogeneous army could match. Hannibal could adapt his battle plans to take advantage of each unit's particular strengths, while compensating for their weaknesses through the complementary abilities of other contingents. As summer approached, both armies began manoeuvring through the heat-baked landscape of southeastern Italy, each seeking to force battle under favourable conditions. Hannibal had established a base near the town of Cannae, a Roman supply depot that controlled access to the rich agricultural regions of Apulia. The position was strategically crucial because it threatened Rome's grain supplies from the south, while providing Hannibal's army with access to the resources they needed to continue the campaign. More importantly, from a tactical perspective, the terrain around Cannae offered the open plains that would allow his superior cavalry to operate most effectively. The landscape around Cannae was dominated by gently rolling hills that descended toward the Aufidus River, known today as the Ofanto. The river valley provided relatively flat ground ideal for large-scale manoeuvres, while the surrounding elevations offered observation posts and potential positions for reserves. The summer heat was already intense, and dust clouds raised by marching armies could be seen for miles across the sun-scorched terrain. Local winds typically blew from the southeast, carrying dust and reducing visibility for anyone facing that direction, a factor that Hannibal would carefully consider in his battle planning. When the Roman army finally approached Cannae in early August, both sides understood that the moment of decision had arrived. The Romans could not allow Hannibal to continue threatening their supply lines and recruiting allies from among the Italian tribes, while Hannibal knew that his strategic position would become untenable if he could not force a decisive victory soon. Carthaginian reinforcements remained trapped in Spain by Roman naval power, and his army's numerical inferiority meant that a prolonged campaign of attrition would inevitably favour Rome. The night before the battle, both camps were alive with activity as commanders made their final preparations. In the Roman camp, Varro and Paulus held council with their subordinate officers, reviewing battle plans and attempting to coordinate the movements of their massive army. The size of their force created both opportunities and challenges. While their numbers were overwhelming, the complexity of managing so many troops in battle had never been attempted before. Roman military doctrine emphasized the disciplined advance of heavy infantry in close formation, an approach that had proven successful against most enemies, but had already failed disastrously against Hannibal's more flexible tactics. Across the plain, Hannibal was putting the finishing touches on one of history's most audacious battle plans. Rather than simply arranging his troops in the strongest possible defensive formation, he was preparing to deliberately weaken his centre while strengthening his flanks, creating a formation that would appear vulnerable to Roman attack, while actually serving as bait for an elaborate trap. The plan required precise timing, exceptional discipline from his troops, and the kind of battlefield control that few generals in history have ever achieved. As dawn broke on August 2nd, 216 BCE, both armies began their deployment across the dusty plains. The morning sun climbed higher in a cloudless sky, promising another day of punishing heat that would test the endurance of heavily armoured men engaged in desperate combat. A hot wind blew from the southeast, stirring up clouds of fine dust that would limit visibility and add to the confusion once battle was joined. Hannibal positioned his army with careful attention to both the terrain and the prevailing wind conditions. His weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, were placed in the centre of his line, arranged in a convex formation that actually projected toward the enemy. This was contrary to every conventional military practice, as it invited attack against the army's most vulnerable point. However, Hannibal's intention was precisely to encourage such an attack, drawing the Roman legions into what would become a deadly trap. On either side of this weak centre, Hannibal positioned his best infantry, veteran Libyan troops equipped with Roman weapons and armour captured in previous battles. These men were arranged in columns rather than extended lines, hidden behind the forward units, and ready to wheel inward once the Romans had committed to their attack on the centre. On the extreme flanks, Hannibal deployed his cavalry forces, with Numidian light horse on the right wing and heavy cavalry commanded by his brother Hasdrubal on the left. The Roman deployment followed more conventional patterns, reflecting both their military traditions and their confidence in superior numbers. The massive infantry force was arranged in the traditional manipular system, with hastati in front, principes in the middle ranks, and triarii veterans forming the rear line. However, the unprecedented size of the army meant that the usual spacing between maniples had to be reduced, creating a more dense and less flexible formation than normal. This compression would prove crucial as the battle developed, as it reduced the Romans' ability to respond to changing tactical situations. Roman cavalry was divided between the flanks, with citizen cavalry under Paulus positioned on the right wing and allied horse under Varro on the left. Both forces were significantly outnumbered by their Carthaginian counterparts, and neither was equipped or trained for the kind of decisive cavalry action that Hannibal planned to employ. Roman military doctrine treated cavalry primarily as a supporting arm for scouting and pursuit, rather than as a battle-winning force in its own right. When the battle commenced, the initial exchanges followed patterns that were familiar from previous engagements. Roman cavalry on both flanks moved forward to engage their Carthaginian counterparts, while the massive infantry formations began their methodical advance toward Hannibal's apparently vulnerable centre. The dust raised by thousands of marching feet and galloping horses began to fill the air, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion that always accompanies large-scale combat. On the Roman right flank, Paulus led his cavalry in a desperate charge against Hasdrubal's heavy horse, but the encounter was brief and decisive. The Carthaginian cavalry, better trained and more numerous, quickly gained the upper hand. Paulus himself was wounded in the fighting and forced to withdraw, leaving his scattered forces unable to provide effective support for the infantry. On the opposite flank, Varro's allied cavalry fared even worse against the Numidian light horse, who used their superior mobility to avoid direct confrontation, while raining javelins on the Roman formations. With both flanks secured, the crucial phase of the battle shifted to the infantry combat in the centre. Here, Hannibal's plan began to unfold with mechanical precision. As the Roman legions crashed into the Gallic and Spanish troops in the Carthaginian centre, these deliberately weakened units began to give ground, falling back in apparent disorder while maintaining just enough cohesion to avoid complete collapse. To the Roman commanders, this retreat looked like the beginning of victory. Their superior numbers and discipline were finally overwhelming the enemy centre, just as conventional military wisdom suggested they should. The Roman advance continued with increasing momentum as more and more legions pressed forward into the gap that seemed to be opening in the Carthaginian line. The manipular system that had served Rome so well in previous wars now worked against them, as the forward units became increasingly compressed and difficult to control. Officers found themselves unable to maintain communication with troops more than a few ranks away, while the dust and noise of battle made coordinated manoeuvres nearly impossible. What the Romans could not see, however, was that Hannibal's retreat was proceeding according to a carefully orchestrated plan. As the Gallic and Spanish troops fell back, they maintained their formation and continued to resist, drawing more and more Roman forces into an increasingly narrow salient. Meanwhile, the African heavy infantry on either side of this developing bulge remained motionless, waiting for the signal to execute the most crucial phase of the battle. The moment Hannibal had been waiting for arrived when the Roman advance had penetrated so deeply into his centre that the leading legions were actually behind the original Carthaginian front line. At this point, the African infantry on both flanks received their orders and began to wheel inward, turning to attack the exposed sides of the Roman formation. These troops, fresh and unengaged until this moment, struck the surprised Romans with devastating effect. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having routed the Roman horse on their front, swept around the rear of the battlefield to attack the Roman infantry from behind. The Numidians joined this assault, and suddenly the massive Roman army found itself attacked from 4 directions simultaneously. What had begun as an apparently successful advance had become a desperate fight for survival, with Roman legions trapped in an ever-tightening circle of enemies. The encirclement that followed was both tactically brilliant and strategically devastating. As the Carthaginian forces contracted their circle, the Romans found themselves compressed into an increasingly small space, where their numerical superiority became a liability rather than an asset. Men could not wield their weapons effectively in the crush, officers could not maneuver their units, and panic began to spread through the ranks as soldiers realized the full extent of their predicament. The slaughter that followed was methodical and comprehensive. Trapped Romans were cut down by spears and swords, trampled by their own comrades, or simply crushed in the press of bodies as the Carthaginian circle grew ever smaller. Some attempts were made to break out of the encirclement, but these were quickly suppressed by fresh Carthaginian troops who had been held in reserve for exactly this purpose. The superior training and equipment that had made Roman legions so effective in open battle became meaningless in the confused melee that the battle had become. Paulus, the consul who had favoured caution, died fighting in the ranks alongside his men, refusing offers of escape and choosing to share the fate of the soldiers he had led into disaster. His colleague Varro managed to escape with a small body of cavalry, but the vast majority of the Roman army was either killed or captured. The casualties were staggering even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. Estimates suggest that between 50 and 70,000 Romans died on the field of Cannae, making it one of the bloodiest single days in military history. Among the dead were not just common soldiers but much of Rome's military and political leadership. 80 senators perished in the battle, along with numerous other magistrates, officers, and members of prominent families. The cream of Roman society had been wiped out in a single afternoon, leaving the state facing not just military defeat but a crisis of leadership that threatened its very survival. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the city was gripped by panic unlike anything in its history. Citizens fled to their homes, shops closed, and rumours spread that Hannibal was already marching on the city. The Senate met in emergency session to coordinate what seemed like preparations for a siege, while magistrates struggled to maintain order among a population that had suddenly realised their apparent invincibility was an illusion. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the aftermath was Hannibal's decision not to march immediately on Rome itself. His officers urged him to advance on the capital, while panic still gripped the city, and before the Romans could organise new defences. Some historians suggest that the city might indeed have fallen if Hannibal had struck immediately, while the psychological impact of Cannae was still paralysing Roman resistance. Instead, Hannibal chose to consolidate his victory by attempting to break up Rome's system of alliances throughout Italy. He released captured allied troops without ransom, hoping to convince them that Carthage offered better terms than Rome. He sent diplomatic missions to wavering Italian cities, promising favourable treatment to those who abandoned the Roman cause. This strategy was not without success. Several important cities, including Capua, the second largest in Italy, declared for Carthage in the months following Cannae. However, Hannibal's strategic pause also gave Rome the time it desperately needed to recover from the immediate shock of defeat. The Romans' response to Cannae demonstrated the resilience and institutional strength that would eventually enable them to dominate the Mediterranean world. Rather than seeking peace or abandoning the war effort, the Senate authorised new levies to replace the lost legions, recalled experienced commanders from other theatres, and implemented emergency measures to maintain the war effort. The Roman strategy shifted back to the Fabian tactics that had frustrated Hannibal before Cannae. New armies were raised with explicit instructions to avoid pitched battles, while harassing Carthaginian forces and protecting loyal cities. The Romans also implemented a scorched earth policy in areas controlled by Hannibal, denying his army the supplies it needed for extended operations while gradually wearing down his forces through attrition. Perhaps most importantly, Rome's network of alliances proved more resilient than Hannibal had anticipated. While some cities did defect to Carthage, the majority remained loyal to Rome, motivated by a combination of fear, self-interest, and genuine belief in Roman protection. This loyalty was maintained through a careful balance of threats and rewards, as Rome demonstrated that it could still protect its friends while ruthlessly punishing those who betrayed their alliance. The war continued for another 14 years after Cannae, with Hannibal maintaining his position in Italy, but unable to achieve the decisive victory that would force Rome to sue for peace. His army gradually declined in strength as casualties mounted, and reinforcements from Carthage remained limited by Roman naval superiority. Meanwhile, Roman forces under Publius Cornelius Scipio opened a new front in Spain, eventually driving Carthaginian forces from their Iberian strongholds and threatening Carthage itself. The final resolution came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio used tactics derived from studying Hannibal's own methods to defeat the Carthaginian general on African soil. The irony was complete when Scipio, later surnamed Africanus in honour of his victory, employed a modified version of the double envelopment that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae to achieve Rome's ultimate triumph in the Second Punic War. The Battle of Cannae's influence on military thinking extended far beyond the immediate conflict between Rome and Carthage. The double envelopment manoeuvre that Hannibal executed so brilliantly became the gold standard for tactical excellence, studied and emulated by generals throughout history. Napoleon Bonaparte analysed the battle extensively and attempted to replicate its principles in his own campaigns, while German staff officers in both world wars sought to achieve Cannae-like encirclements of enemy forces. The American Civil War saw several attempts to recreate Cannae's tactical model, most notably at the Battle of Chickamauga, where Confederate forces achieved a partial double envelopment of Union troops. During World War II, the German concept of blitzkrieg was explicitly designed to achieve Cannae-style encirclements on a strategic scale, using rapid armoured advances to surround and destroy entire enemy army groups. Even in the modern era, military academies around the world continue to study Cannae as an example of tactical perfection achieved through superior generalship, careful planning, and flawless execution under pressure. The battle demonstrates how a smaller, weaker force can achieve decisive victory through superior strategy and the intelligent use of terrain, weather, and enemy psychology. The psychological impact of Cannae extended beyond its immediate military consequences to influence Roman national character in ways that would shape the empire's future development. The disaster taught Romans that their survival as a people depended not on avoiding defeat but on their ability to recover from catastrophic setbacks. This lesson would serve them well in future crises, from the invasions of Germanic tribes to the civil wars that marked the end of the Republic. The memory of Cannae also reinforced Roman determination never again to allow foreign armies to ravage Italian soil unopposed. This defensive mentality contributed to Rome's aggressive expansion throughout the Mediterranean, as successive generations of leaders concluded that the best defence lay in controlling potential threats at their source, rather than waiting for enemies to strike at Roman territory. For Hannibal himself, Cannae represented both the pinnacle of his military genius and the beginning of his strategic failure. His tactical brilliance in achieving the perfect battle was matched by his inability to translate battlefield victory into lasting political success. The decision not to march on Rome immediately after Cannae has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia, with some arguing that the opportunity for decisive victory was lost forever in those crucial days following the battle. Modern analysis suggests that Hannibal's strategy of attempting to break up Roman alliances through diplomacy rather than military conquest was not necessarily flawed, but that he underestimated both Roman resilience and the strength of the alliance system he sought to destroy. His army, while tactically superior, lacked the logistical support and reinforcements necessary for the kind of sustained campaign that would have been required to force Rome's capitulation. The Battle of Cannae thus stands as both a testament to individual military genius and a demonstration of the limits of tactical excellence when not supported by adequate strategic resources. Hannibal's achievement in destroying a Roman army twice the size of his own remains one of history's greatest military accomplishments, yet his inability to capitalise on this victory ultimately contributed to Carthage's defeat in the broader war. Today, the plains around Cannae remain largely agricultural, with few visible traces of the carnage that once soaked the dusty soil with the blood of tens of thousands of soldiers. Archaeological investigations have uncovered artefacts from the battle, corroded weapons, armour fragments, and coins that provide physical evidence of the ancient conflict. These silent witnesses serve as reminders of a day when the fate of the Western world hung in the balance, decided by the tactical genius of one man and the courage of soldiers from across the Mediterranean who fought and died under the burning Italian sun. The legacy of Cannae extends beyond military history to encompass broader questions about leadership, strategy, and the relationship between tactical excellence and strategic success. It reminds us that individual brilliance, while crucial, must be supported by adequate resources and long-term planning to achieve lasting results. Most importantly, it demonstrates how a single day's fighting can echo through millennia, influencing military thinking and shaping the course of civilizations long after the dust of battle has settled and the warriors have returned to Earth. The immediate weeks following Cannae reveal the true character of both civilizations involved in this titanic struggle. While Hannibal celebrated his victory and attempted to capitalize on Roman panic, the response from Rome itself demonstrated the institutional resilience that would ultimately prove decisive in the broader conflict. The Senate, despite losing 80 of its members in the battle, continued to function and make crucial decisions about the war effort. Emergency magistrates were appointed to replace fallen leaders, new levies were authorized despite the catastrophic losses, and diplomatic missions were dispatched to ensure the loyalty of wavering allies. The Roman people's reaction to the disaster was perhaps even more remarkable than their government's response. Rather than demanding peace negotiations or calling for the recall of armies from other theatres, the citizenry demonstrated a grim determination to continue the struggle regardless of cost. Families who had lost sons, fathers and brothers at Cannae volunteered remaining male relatives for military service. Wealthy Romans contributed their personal fortunes to fund new legions, while poorer citizens offered their labour for fortification work and military production. This collective response was rooted in Roman cultural values that elevated duty to the state above individual survival or comfort. The concept of virtues, which encompassed courage, excellence, and moral strength, had been tested at Cannae and found to endure even in the face of unprecedented catastrophe. Romans understood that their civilization faced an existential threat, and they were prepared to sacrifice everything to ensure its survival. Hannibal, observing this Roman response from his camp in southern Italy, must have realized that his victory at Cannae, devastating as it was, had not achieved its primary strategic objective of forcing Rome to seek terms. Instead of breaking Roman will to resist, the battle seemed to have hardened their determination to continue the war until Carthage was completely defeated. The psychological warfare that had been so effective in previous campaigns was proving insufficient against an enemy whose cultural identity was built around the refusal to accept defeat. The diplomatic offensive that Hannibal launched in the aftermath of Cannae met with mixed results that highlighted the complex nature of Roman power in Italy. While some cities did abandon the Roman alliance, particularly in southern Italy where Carthaginian military presence offered immediate protection, the vast majority remained loyal despite the obvious military risks. This loyalty was based not merely on fear of Roman retaliation, but on genuine calculation of long-term interests and cultural affinity. Rome's alliance system differed fundamentally from the tributary relationships that characterized most ancient empires. Rather than simply extracting wealth and manpower from subject peoples, Rome offered a path to citizenship and full participation in Roman civilization. Italian allies understood that Roman defeat would not necessarily improve their situation, while Roman victory offered the possibility of advancement within an expanding imperial system. The defection of Capua, however, represented a significant strategic blow that demonstrated both the opportunities and limitations of Hannibal's diplomatic approach. As the second largest city in Italy and the centre of a rich agricultural region, Capua's adherence to the Carthaginian cause provided Hannibal with crucial logistical support and a prestigious symbol of Roman weakness. The city's leaders calculated that Carthaginian victory was inevitable and sought to position themselves advantageously in the post-war settlement. Yet Capua's defection also illustrated the fundamental problem with Hannibal's strategy. The city's decision was based on the assumption that Carthaginian military success would continue indefinitely, and that Rome lacked the resources to recover from defeats like Cannae. When these assumptions proved incorrect, Capua found itself isolated and vulnerable to Roman retaliation, ultimately suffering a brutal siege and harsh punishment that served as an object lesson to other potential defectors. The gradual shift in Roman strategy following Cannae demonstrated remarkable institutional learning and adaptability. The appointment of Marcus Claudius Marcellus as a key military commander marked the beginning of a more aggressive approach that combined Fabian harassment tactics with opportunistic strikes against isolated Carthaginian forces. Marcellus earned the nickname Sword of Rome for his willingness to engage Hannibal's army when circumstances offered reasonable chances of success. This evolving Roman approach was exemplified in the Siege of Syracuse, where Marcellus demonstrated that Roman forces could still achieve decisive victories against sophisticated opponents. The lengthy siege showcased Roman engineering capabilities and logistical endurance, while the eventual capture of the city eliminated a potential source of support for Carthage and Sicily. The death of Archimedes during the siege, despite Roman orders to capture him alive, symbolized the tragic costs of the broader conflict. Meanwhile, the emergence of Publius Cornelius Scipio as a major Roman commander marked the beginning of a new phase in the war that would ultimately lead to Carthaginian defeat. Scipio's campaigns in Spain demonstrated that Roman military leadership was learning from earlier defeats and developing new tactical approaches specifically designed to counter Carthaginian advantages. His victory at the Battle of Ilipa showed that Roman generals could now match Hannibal's own tactical innovations, using flexible formations and coordinated attacks to defeat experienced Carthaginian armies. The psychological warfare that had been such a crucial element of Hannibal's early successes was gradually losing its effectiveness as Roman commanders gained experience fighting Carthaginian forces. The terror that had gripped Roman armies after Trebia and Trasimene was replaced by a more pragmatic understanding of Carthaginian strengths and weaknesses. Roman soldiers learned that Carthaginian troops, despite their tactical superiority, were mortal men who could be defeated through proper preparation and execution. Hannibal's position in Italy became increasingly precarious as the war dragged on without decisive results. His army, while still formidable, was slowly being worn down by constant campaigning and the inability to secure adequate reinforcements from Carthage. The diversity that had once been a source of tactical flexibility was becoming a liability as different ethnic contingents began to lose cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The arrival of Hasdrubal Barca with a second Carthaginian army offered the prospect of reinforcing Hannibal's position and potentially achieving the decisive victory that had eluded him since Cannae. However, the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 BCE, where Roman forces intercepted and destroyed Hasdrubal's army, eliminated this last hope for Carthaginian success in Italy. When Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, it symbolised not just personal loss, but the definitive end of Carthaginian strategic hopes in the Italian theatre. The final phase of the Second Punic War saw the conflict's centre of gravity shift from Italy to Africa as Scipio launched his invasion of Carthaginian home territory. This strategic reversal, which forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland, demonstrated how completely the strategic initiative had passed to Rome. The very tactics that Hannibal had used to threaten Rome were now being employed against Carthage itself. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE provided a fitting conclusion to the military career of history's greatest tactical genius. Facing Scipio on the plains of North Africa, Hannibal found himself commanding an army that lacked the cavalry superiority and tactical cohesion that had made his earlier victories possible. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's methods throughout the war, employed a modified version of the double envelopment to achieve decisive victory against his former tormentor. The irony of Hannibal's defeat was that it came through the application of his own tactical innovations by an enemy who had learned from repeated defeats. Scipio's victory at Zama represented not just Roman military success, but the triumph of institutional learning over individual genius. Where Hannibal had relied on personal tactical brilliance, Rome had developed systematic approaches to warfare that could be employed by competent commanders even in the absence of exceptional talent. The peace treaty that ended the Second Punic War reduced Carthage to a client state of Rome, stripped of its navy, most of its territory, and any capacity for independent military action. The terms were deliberately harsh, designed to ensure that Carthage could never again threaten Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. Hannibal himself was eventually forced into exile, spending his remaining years as a military advisor to various eastern kingdoms that opposed Roman expansion. The transformation of the Mediterranean world following Cannae and the Second Punic War established patterns that would dominate international relations for centuries. Rome's victory demonstrated that tactical brilliance, while important, was ultimately less decisive than strategic resources, institutional resilience, and the ability to learn from defeat. These lessons would guide Roman expansion throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, creating an empire that endured for over a millennium. The cultural impact of Cannae on Roman society extended far beyond immediate military consequences. The disaster became a defining moment in Roman national consciousness, a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience that shaped imperial ideology for generations. Roman writers and historians repeatedly returned to the battle as an example of how divine favour could be lost through hubris, but regained through perseverance and proper devotion to traditional values. The memory of Cannae also influenced Roman military reforms that created the professional legions of the imperial period. The disaster highlighted weaknesses in the citizen-soldier system that made Rome vulnerable to enemies with superior military training and experience. Subsequent reforms emphasized longer terms of service, better training, and standardized equipment that would make Roman armies less dependent on individual commanders and more capable of sustained operations in distant theatres. Educational systems throughout the Roman world incorporated lessons from Cannae into their curricula, ensuring that future generations of leaders understood both the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of institutional solidarity in times of crisis. The battle became a standard example in rhetorical training, used to illustrate principles of narrative structure, character development, and moral instruction that formed the foundation of classical education. The influence of Cannae on military thinking extended well beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire to affect military development throughout the ancient world. Eastern kingdoms facing Roman expansion studied Hannibal's tactics as potential models for their own defensive strategies, while Roman enemies sought to replicate the psychological and tactical advantages that had made the Carthaginian general so formidable. Medieval military writers rediscovered classical accounts of Cannae during the revival of interest in ancient texts, incorporating lessons from the battle into contemporary military manuals and strategic thinking. The concept of the double envelopment became a standard element of military education, though few commanders possessed the skill or circumstances necessary to execute such a complex manoeuvre successfully. The Renaissance witnessed renewed scholarly interest in Cannae as military theorists sought to apply classical principles to contemporary warfare. The development of gunpowder weapons and changes in army organisation created new tactical possibilities, but the fundamental principles demonstrated at Cannae, the importance of reconnaissance, terrain analysis, troop morale and coordinated attacks, remained relevant to military professionals. Modern military historians continue to analyse Cannae as perhaps the finest example of tactical artistry in recorded history, a demonstration of how superior generalship can overcome seemingly impossible odds through careful planning and flawless execution. The battle serves as a case study in multiple military disciplines, from logistics and intelligence to leadership and battlefield psychology. Contemporary military academies around the world include Cannae in their core curricula as an example of tactical perfection that remains relevant despite changes in weapons technology and organisational structure. The principles that Hannibal employed, deception, concentration of force at decisive points, exploitation of enemy weaknesses and maintenance of tactical flexibility, continue to guide military planning in the modern era. The enduring fascination with Cannae reflects broader human interest in stories of David versus Goliath, where intelligence and determination overcome brute force and superior resources. Hannibal's achievement resonates across cultures and centuries because it demonstrates the power of individual excellence to change the course of history, even when ultimate victory remains beyond reach. Yet the complete story of Cannae also serves as a reminder that tactical brilliance alone is insufficient to achieve lasting political objectives. Hannibal's masterpiece on the battlefield could not compensate for Carthage's strategic weaknesses or overcome Rome's institutional advantages. The battle thus illustrates both the potential and the limitations of military genius in shaping historical outcomes. The dusty plains of Cannae continue to attract visitors from around the world, drawn by the site's historical significance and the enduring questions it raises about leadership, strategy, and the nature of victory itself. Standing on the ground where one of history's greatest battles was fought, modern observers can appreciate both the scale of Hannibal's achievement and the broader historical forces that ultimately determined the conflict's outcome. The silence of the ancient battlefield speaks eloquently of human ambition, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between individual brilliance and collective endurance that defines the human experience across all ages and civilizations.